Alara Wilson was 32 when she received the certified letter that would shatter her carefully rebuilt world. Her biological parents, the same people who had abandoned her at just 4 months old, were now suing her for the entirety of her grandfather's $3.4 million estate. The audacity was breathtaking. These strangers who shared her DNA, but nothing of her life, now wanted to claim what her grandfather had explicitly left to her, the granddaughter he had raised as his own daughter after their betrayal. Before I dive deeper into this family vengeance story that changed my life forever, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you enjoy true family drama with karma endings. Trust me, you'll want to stick around to see how these people who abandoned their baby daughter suddenly reappeared when money was involved, and what happened next. The story of how Alara came to be raised by her grandfather began in the cold January of 1993. Patricia and Richard Wilson, her biological parents, were struggling financially and emotionally. Patricia, just 22, had never wanted to be a mother, and Richard, 24, was more interested in his dreams of becoming a musician than in midnight feedings. Their relationship had been rocky from the start, more passion than substance, and the unexpected pregnancy had only intensified their problems. When Alara was born on September 15th, 1992, her parents tried to adapt to their new reality. Patricia suffered from what would later be diagnosed as severe postpartum depression, but in those days, her condition went largely unrecognized and untreated. Richard worked odd jobs and spent evenings playing in dive bars around Chicago, coming home late and leaving early. The resentment between them grew as rapidly as their tiny daughter. By the time Alara reached 4 months, the situation had deteriorated beyond repair. On a particularly bitter winter morning, Richard packed a small suitcase, while Patricia bundled up their infant daughter. Neither spoke much as they drove across town to Patricia's father's house, Harold Peterson, a widower who had raised Patricia alone after her mother died from cancer when she was 12. "Dad, we need your help," Patricia had said when Harold opened the door. "Just for a few weeks until we get back on our feet." Harold, a retired high school principal with a kind face weathered by years of both joy and sorrow, took one look at his exhausted daughter, his distant son-in-law, and the innocent baby bundled in a worn blanket and knew immediately. This was more than a temporary situation. "Of course," was all he said, taking his granddaughter into his arms with a natural ease that belied the fact he hadn't held a baby in more than 2 decades. What was supposed to be a few weeks turned into a month. 1 month became 3. Communication from Patricia and Richard became sporadic. A phone call every couple of weeks, then once a month, then nothing. No child support, no visits, not even a birthday card. They had simply vanished from Chicago, reportedly heading west to California to make a fresh start. Harold, at 62, found himself raising an infant once again. But unlike many in his position, he never resented this unexpected responsibility. Quite the opposite, Alara became his reason for living, the light that filled the emptiness left by his wife's death, and now his daughter's abandonment. "It's just you and me now, little star," he would tell Alara, explaining that her name came from one of Jupiter's moons, something her mother had read about during pregnancy. "We'll build our own little solar system." And build it they did. Harold formally adopted Alara when she was 3 years old, after all attempts to contact Patricia and Richard failed, and they were declared legally to have abandoned their child. He converted his home office into a cheerful nursery, painted soft yellow with stars on the ceiling. He learned to braid hair, bandage skinned knees, and navigate the complicated social hierarchies of elementary school birthday parties. As Alara grew, Harold made sure she knew the truth about her parents in age-appropriate ways that neither demonized them nor excused their actions. "Sometimes adults make choices they can't take back," he explained. "When she was 7, and asking more pointed questions about why she didn't have a mom like her friends. But those choices reflect their limitations, not your worthiness. Harold's modest pension was enough for their needs, but he was careful with money, putting away what he could for Alara's education. Their life was simple, but rich with experiences. Library visits every Saturday, camping trips in the summer, and holiday traditions they created together. Harold taught Alara to play chess, to grow vegetables in their small backyard garden, and most importantly, to value her own strength and resilience. By the time Alara was in high school, she had come to terms with her parents' abandonment, or so she thought. She was an excellent student, particularly drawn to science and mathematics, with a small circle of close friends who knew her story and never made her feel different because of it. Harold attended every science fair, every academic awards ceremony, beaming with unrestrained pride at the remarkable young woman his granddaughter was becoming. When it came time for college, Alara received a partial scholarship to Northwestern University to study biomedical engineering. Harold, now in his late 70s but still sharp and engaged, insisted on helping with the remaining tuition. "Your education is the most important investment I could ever make," he told her. "This is exactly what I've been saving for all these years." What Harold never told Alara was that he had made another significant investment in a life insurance policy and in careful estate planning that would ensure she would be taken care of after he was gone. He had watched too many families torn apart by inheritance disputes, had counseled too many students whose family relationships were poisoned by money. Harold was determined that Alara would be protected, that his legacy to her would be secure. What he couldn't have predicted was how desperately that protection would be needed, or that the greatest threat to Alara's inheritance would come from the very people who had walked away from her life so many years ago. The people who, as far as Alara was concerned, had forfeited any right to call themselves her parents or to make claims on the bonds of family they had so easily discarded. But before that storm would break over her life, Alara had years of relative peace with the only parent she had ever really known, her grandfather, who had chosen her when her biological parents had not. The man who had taught her that family is defined by love and presence, not merely by blood or obligation. The foundation he built would be tested in ways neither of them could imagine, but it would prove stronger than the forces that would try to break it. Alara's childhood with her grandfather was marked by stability and love, but the absence of her biological parents left inevitable scars. In elementary school, Mother's and Father's Day celebrations were particularly difficult. While other children made construction paper, cards, and plaster handprints, Alara would create her projects for her grandfather, who the teachers thoughtfully included in the grandparents' celebrations instead. But the questions from classmates were sometimes harder to navigate. "Why doesn't your mom ever pick you up?" a girl named Madison asked her in second grade during recess. "I live with my grandpa," Alara had answered simply. "But everyone has a mom and dad," Madison insisted, her 7-year-old logic uncompromising. These moments forced Alara to develop explanations that she could share without feeling exposed. By third grade, she had settled on, "My parents couldn't take care of me, so my grandpa does." This usually satisfied most children's curiosity, though occasionally a more persistent child would press for details she wasn't ready to share. Harold encouraged her to express her feelings about her parents' absence rather than suppressing them. When she was 9, he helped her start a journal where she could write letters to her parents that would never be sent. Sometimes these letters were angry, filled with the raw hurt of abandonment. "Dear Mom and Dad, why didn't you want me? Was I too much trouble? Grandpa says I'm not, but you left. Did you ever think about me after? Do you even know what I look like now?" she wrote, in one particularly heartfelt entry. Other times, the letters were curious, imagining what her parents might be like, where they might be living. If they had other children, siblings, she would never know. Harold also enlisted the help of a child psychologist when Alara was 11 and began experiencing anxiety about going to school functions, fearing her grandfather might not come back for her, a delayed manifestation of abandonment. Trauma. Dr. Levine helped Alara understand that her fears, while real, were based on past experiences that weren't likely to repeat. Your grandfather has shown you every day for 11 years that he keeps his promises, Dr. Levine gently reminded her. That's a lot of evidence that you can count on him. As Alara moved into adolescence, the questions about her identity intensified. She found herself studying her reflection, trying to discern which features might have come from her mother, which from her father. Her hazel eyes and high cheekbones, Harold told her, were just like Patricia's. Her analytical mind and musical talents, though she preferred the piano to her father's guitar, those likely came from Richard. When Alara was 14, she asked Harold if they could try to find her parents. Not to establish contact, she was quick to clarify, but just to know where they were, what had become of them. Harold, who had occasionally run his own discreet searches over the years, agreed. Together, they hired a private investigator who specialized in finding missing persons. After 3 weeks, the PI returned with a thin file. Patricia and Richard had indeed moved to California, first to Los Angeles, where Richard had tried unsuccessfully to break into the music industry, then to Sacramento, where they had eventually divorced when Alara was 7. Patricia had remarried and was now Patricia Lawson's stepmother to 2 children from her husband's previous marriage, but with no biological children of her own. Richard had moved to Portland, Oregon, had never remarried, and worked as a music teacher at a private school. The file included recent photographs. Patricia looked like a more sophisticated version of the young woman who had left Alara behind. Her hair, now expensively, highlighted her clothes, speaking of middle-class comfort. Richard had aged less well, his face lined and his hair thinning, though he maintained the artistic aesthetics of his youth. Alara spent hours studying these strangers who were nonetheless a part of her. The experience left her with mixed emotions: relief that they were alive and seemingly well, anger that they had gone on to build lives without any apparent regret for the daughter they'd abandoned, and a confusing sense of closure that didn't actually close anything. "What do you want to do with this information?" Harold asked her gently after giving her space to process. Alara considered for several days before answering. "Nothing," she finally decided. "They know where we live. They've always known. If they wanted to find me, they could have." Harold nodded, neither encouraging nor discouraging her decision. "That's completely your choice. And you can always change your mind." But Alara didn't change her mind. Instead, she threw herself into her academic pursuits and extracurricular activities with renewed focus. She joined the debate team, discovered a passion for competitive swimming, and maintained her position on the honor roll. Her grandfather attended every meet, every tournament, every awards ceremony, a constant supportive presence that made the absence of her biological parents less acute. By her senior year of high school, Alara had developed a philosophical perspective on her unusual family situation. "Family is who shows up," she told her best friend Zoe during a late-night conversation about Zoe's parents' divorce. "Biology is just genetics. Family is who chooses to be there for the hard stuff, the boring stuff, the everyday stuff." Harold's health began to decline subtly during Alara's freshman year of college. Nothing dramatic: some increased fatigue, occasional forgetfulness, a persistent cough he attributed to seasonal allergies. He downplayed these symptoms during their weekly phone calls and weekend visits, not wanting to worry his granddaughter when she was finally spreading her wings at university. But by the middle of her sophomore year, Alara could no longer ignore the changes in her grandfather. His once robust frame had thinned, and the quick wit that had made their chess games challenging was sometimes slowed by a fog of confusion. After much gentle insistence, she convinced him to see a doctor. The diagnosis was devastating: stage 3 lung cancer that had already begun to metastasize. The oncologist outlined treatment options with compassionate directness, but the prognosis was guarded at best. Harold, ever practical, insisted on hearing the unvarnished truth about his condition and his chances. "I've had a good run," he told Alara afterward in the car, reaching over to squeeze her hand as she fought back tears. 79 years, and the best part was raising you." Alara immediately took a leave of absence from Northwestern to become her grandfather's caregiver. Her professors were understanding, allowing her to complete some coursework remotely. Harold initially protested, insisting she shouldn't interrupt her education, but Alara was as stubborn as he had taught her to be. "You've been there for me my entire life," she told him firmly. "Now it's my turn." The next 8 months were a blur of doctor's appointments, chemotherapy sessions, medication schedules, and increasingly necessary personal care as Harold's strength ebbed. Through it all, Alara maintained a front of optimistic determination, researching experimental treatments, consulting with specialists, and creating nutritious meals that might tempt Harold's diminishing appetite. In private moments, usually late at night after Harold had finally fallen asleep, she allowed herself to feel the crushing weight of impending loss. The man who had been her entire world, her safety net, her most ardent supporter, was slipping away despite every effort to hold on to him. What Alara didn't know then was that in between treatments, during moments when she was in class or running errands, Harold was meeting with his attorney, meticulously updating his will and ensuring that his modest estate, considerably less modest by some prescient investments over the years, would pass smoothly to his granddaughter. He was also writing her letters, dozens of them, to be opened at future milestones. He knew he wouldn't live to see her college graduation, her first real job, her wedding day, should that come to pass. In each letter, he poured out his pride in her, his wishes for her future, and his absolute confidence in her ability to navigate life's challenges. And in one letter marked "Open if they ever return," he addressed the possibility that her biological parents might someday reappear in her life. This letter contained not only emotional guidance but practical advice about protecting herself, legally advice that would prove prescient in ways Harold could not have fully anticipated. Harold's condition deteriorated rapidly despite the aggressive treatment regimen. By spring, he had moved from active treatment to palliative care, focused on quality of life rather than extending it. Alara converted their living room into a comfortable bedroom, so Harold wouldn't have to navigate the stairs, positioning his hospital bed near the large bay window where he could watch the garden he'd tended for decades burst into bloom one final time. These last precious months together held an intensity of emotion that neither had experienced before. Conversations that might once have seemed too difficult became essential. Harold spoke openly about his impending death, not with fear but with a philosopher's acceptance. "Death is just the next journey," he told Alara one evening as the sunset painted the room in amber hues. "The only real tragedy would be if I hadn't lived fully while I had the chance." Alara, holding his increasingly frail hand, tried to match his courage. "And have you lived fully?" Harold's smile was peaceful. "More than most, I think. I've loved deeply. I've helped shape a young life. I've tried to leave the world a little better than I found it. What more could anyone ask for?" During these conversations, Harold sometimes alluded to his financial arrangements, though never in great detail. "You'll be taken care of," he assured her. "I've made sure of that." What Alara didn't fully understand was the extent of her grandfather's estate. Harold had lived modestly by choice, not necessity. His years as a high school principal had provided a decent pension, but his real financial security came from inheritance and investments. Harold's own father had been a shrewd businessman who had left his son a substantial portfolio, which Harold had managed conservatively but effectively over the decades. Additionally, Harold had purchased several rental properties in Chicago neighborhoods before they gentrified properties that had multiplied in value many times over. In total, Harold's estate was worth approximately $3.4 million, a fact that would have shocked Alara, who had grown up thinking of them as solidly middle class, but certainly not wealthy. Harold had deliberately kept his financial situation private, wanting Alara to develop a strong work ethic and sense of purpose beyond material comfort. 3 weeks before Harold died, he asked Alara to help him to his desk, where he removed a leather-bound journal from a locked drawer. "This is for you," he said, placing it in her hands. "Not to read now, but after. It contains things I want you to know, things that might be easier to understand in my own words than from lawyers and bank statements." Alara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, and placed the journal in her own desk drawer. She couldn't bear to think about after just yet. On a quiet Tuesday morning in June, with sunlight streaming through the window and birds singing in the cherry tree he had planted when Alara lost her first tooth, Harold Peterson took his final breath. Alara was holding his hand, having just finished reading to him from his favorite Steinbeck novel. The hospice nurse gently confirmed what Alara already knew: her grandfather, her true parent in every way that mattered, was gone. The days that followed passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, condolence calls, and the strange, hollow feeling of returning to an empty house that still contained all the evidence of Harold's life, but none of his living presence. Neighbors and Harold's former colleagues brought casseroles and shared stories. Alara moved through these rituals like a sleepwalker, functioning on autopilot while her grief remained too vast to fully comprehend. 2 weeks after the funeral, Harold's attorney Michael Winters, who had been a friend as well as a legal advisor, came to the house for the formal reading of the will. Alara had expected this to be a straightforward process. She was Harold's only family after all. What she hadn't expected was the revelation of just how substantial her inheritance would be. "Your grandfather was an exceptionally prudent financial manager," Michael explained as he laid out the details. "The house is paid off and now in your name. There are 4 rental properties, all with long-term tenants, and managed by a company that will continue to handle day-to-day operations. There are investment accounts totaling just over $2 million and insurance policies with you as the beneficiary for another $800,000. Alara sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile this information with the grandfather who had carefully clipped coupons and bought his clothes at department store sales. "He wanted to ensure your future was secure," Michael continued gently. "But he was also adamant that you understand money as a tool, not an identity. That's why he lived the way he did, and why he was so focused on your education and character development." Michael then handed her a sealed envelope. "This is the letter he asked me to give you privately. There are some matters he wanted to discuss with you directly." Later that night, alone in the quiet house, Alara opened the envelope with trembling hands. Harold's familiar handwriting filled several pages, the sight of it so viscerally him that tears blurred her vision before she could read a single word. "My dearest Alara," the letter began. "If you're reading this, I've begun my next great adventure and you're facing your first days without me. I wish I could spare you this pain, but since I cannot, I want to at least offer you some guidance for the path ahead. First, about the money. Yes, it's substantial and perhaps a shock to you. I kept it private, not out of distrust, but because I wanted you to become who you are, through your own efforts and choices, not through any expectation of inheritance. Use it wisely to further your education, to establish yourself in your career, to travel and experience the world. But remember that true wealth isn't in bank accounts, but in how we treat others and the difference we make. Second, and this is difficult to write, I must warn you about the possibility of your biological parents reappearing. Over the years, I've occasionally received communications from them, mostly from Patricia, inquiring obliquely about my financial situation and making vague references to family connections. I've never responded in detail, but I've had reason to believe they might attempt to assert claims after my death. To protect you from this possibility, I've structured my will very specifically. The adoptions were legally bulletproof, and I've included provisions that explicitly disinherit Patricia and Richard. Michael has all the documentation and will defend your interests vigorously should the need arise. But legal protections aside, I want you to be prepared emotionally for this possibility. If they do resurface, remember that their motivations may not be pure. Trust your instincts and don't let guilt or manipulation cloud your judgment. You owe them nothing, not explanations, not forgiveness, not a share of what I've worked to provide for you. This may sound harsh coming from me who always taught you to seek understanding and compassion. But there is a difference between forgiveness and allowing yourself to be used. You can forgive them their failings without giving them power over your present or future. Whatever happens, know that I am proud beyond measure of the woman you've become. Your strength, your intelligence, your capacity for both critical thinking and deep feeling, these are your true inheritance and ones that can never be taken from you. The letter continued with more personal reflections and ended with a poignant reminder. Stars burn brightest in the darkest skies, my little Ilara. Let your grief transform into light. Ilara read the letter 3 times that night, each reading revealing new layers of her grandfather's foresight and love. She then turned to the leather journal he had given her, which contained not only his thoughts on their life together, but detailed explanations of his financial decisions, contacts for all the professionals who managed various aspects of his estate, and practical advice for navigating her newfound financial responsibilities. What she didn't find either in the letter or the journal was any contact information for Patricia and Richard, or any clue as to when they had last communicated with Harold. This omission felt deliberate. Harold was leaving the choice entirely in her hands, as he always had when it came to her biological parents. Ilara placed the letter and journal in Harold's old desk and tried to process everything she had learned. The idea that her biological parents might attempt to claim part of her inheritance seemed both infuriating and somehow inevitable, the final betrayal from people whose first betrayal had shaped her entire life. But Harold had prepared her for this possibility, as he had prepared her for everything else with honesty, practical wisdom, and confidence in her ability to handle whatever challenges arose. She would honor his memory by facing this potential threat with the same courage and integrity he had modeled throughout her life. What Ilara couldn't know was how quickly this threat would materialize, or how brazenly her biological parents would assert their claims. The certified letter that would arrive just 6 weeks after Harold's death would mark the beginning of a battle that would test everything her grandfather had taught her about family justice and standing firm in her own truth. The certified letter arrived on a Thursday morning in August, exactly 6 weeks and 2 days after Harold's funeral. Ilara had just returned to Northwestern for her junior year, throwing herself into her studies as both distraction and tribute to her grandfather's belief in education. She was home for the weekend to check on the house and sort through more of Harold's belongings when the doorbell rang. Ilara Wilson, the delivery person, confirmed holding out an electronic signature pad. Inside the envelope was a formal legal notice from a law firm in Sacramento, California. The language was dense with legal terminology, but the essence was clear. Patricia Lawson, née Peterson, and Richard Wilson were contesting Harold Peterson's will on grounds of undue influence and testamentary incapacity. They were claiming that Harold had not been of sound mind when executing his last will and testament, and that as his biological daughter, Patricia had a rightful claim to a significant portion of his estate. They were demanding immediate mediation or would proceed to file suit in probate court. Alara's hands shook as she read and reread the document. The audacity was staggering. These people, she couldn't bring herself to think of them as her parents who had walked away from their infant daughter and never looked back, were now emerging from the shadows to claim what Harold had explicitly intended for her. More disturbing still were the supporting documents included with the notice. There were copies of birthday cards allegedly sent to Alara over the years that she had never received, suggesting an ongoing relationship that had never existed. There were references to phone calls that had never occurred and visits that had never taken place. They had constructed an elaborate fiction of maintained family ties that bore no resemblance to the reality of Alara's abandoned childhood. With rising panic, Alara called Michael Winters, who answered despite it being a Saturday. "Michael, I've received a letter they're contesting the will, my biological parents." Her words tumbled out in fragmented distress. "Slow down, Alara," Michael's calm voice steadied her. "I've received a copy as well. This is exactly what your grandfather anticipated might happen, and we're fully prepared. Can you come to my office Monday morning at 9:00? That weekend was one of the longest of Alara's life. She alternated between rage at the callous opportunism of Patricia and Richard, fear that they might somehow succeed in their claims, and profound gratitude for Harold's foresight in preparing her for this very scenario. She reread his letter and journal multiple times, drawing strength from his words. "You owe them nothing," he had written. Those words became her mantra as she prepared to fight for what was rightfully hers. Monday morning found Alara in Michael's office, dressed in a conservative navy suit that had been her grandfather's last birthday gift to her. Michael welcomed her with a supportive smile and ushered her into a conference room where two other attorneys were waiting. "Alara, this is Diane Shapiro, our firm's probate litigation specialist, and James Chen, who specializes in family law. They'll be working with me on your case." The next 2 hours were a crash course in estate litigation. Michael and his colleagues outlined the legal strategy they had already begun implementing based on Harold's explicit instructions in the event of a challenge from Patricia and Richard. "Your grandfather was meticulous," Diane explained, showing Alara a thick file of documentation. "He kept records of every attempt Patricia and Richard made to contact him over the years, which were few and far between, and almost always coincided with financial difficulties on their part." The file contained letters dating back to when Alara was 5 years old, when Patricia had written requesting family assistance for medical bills. There was another from when Alara was 12, when Richard had reached out about investing in a business opportunity. Harold had responded to each with brief factual replies that offered no financial information or support. Most damning were the letters from just after Alara's 16th birthday, when Patricia had more explicitly referenced Harold's estate planning. "As your only child, I want to ensure that our family legacy is protected," she had written, with no mention of the granddaughter she had abandoned. Harold had consulted with his attorneys after each communication, documenting his concerns that Patricia and Richard's sporadic interest was financially motivated, rather than reflecting any genuine desire to reconnect with their daughter. Additionally, James added the adoption was finalized when you were 3, with both Patricia and Richard signing away their parental rights. They were given multiple opportunities to maintain a relationship with you and declined each time. "So they don't have a case?" Alara asked hopefully. The attorneys exchanged glances. "Their case is extremely weak," Michael clarified, "but that doesn't mean they won't pursue it. People motivated by money can be persistent, especially when they believe there's a substantial sum at stake. What they're hoping," Diane added, "is that you'll settle. They're betting that you'll be willing to give them something rather than go through a protracted legal battle." Alara straightened in her chair, her grandfather's voice clear in her memory. "There is a difference between forgiveness and allowing yourself to be used. "I won't give them a cent," she said firmly. "Not after what they did." Michael nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what your grandfather predicted you'd say. And we're fully prepared to fight this all the way." The strategy session continued with the legal team outlining next steps. They would respond to the initial notice with a firm rejection of mediation and a detailed explanation of why the challenge had no merit. They would also counter with evidence of abandonment and the legally binding adoption documents. "Be prepared for this to get personal," James warned. "They'll likely try to portray Harold in a negative light, suggesting he manipulated the situation to alienate you from your biological parents." The thought of anyone disparaging her grandfather made Alara's blood boil. "They have no idea who they're dealing with," she said, her voice low and determined. As the meeting concluded, Michael handed Alara a business card. "This is Dr. Rebecca Torres, a therapist who specializes in family trauma. Your grandfather arranged for her services to be part of your estate administration if needed. This kind of battle can take an emotional toll, and he wanted you to have professional support." Alara's eyes welled with tears at this final evidence of Harold's thoroughness in protecting her. "He thought of everything, didn't he?" Michael smiled gently. "He loved you very much, and he knew exactly who he was dealing with in Patricia and Richard. He wasn't going to leave anything to chance." As Alara left the law office, the initial shock and fear had transformed into something more focused, a steely determination to honor her grandfather by defending what he had built and entrusted to her. This wasn't just about money. It was about respecting Harold's wishes and refusing to allow the people who had abandoned her to profit from that abandonment. Walking to her car, Alara felt her phone vibrate with a text message from an unknown number. "Alara, this is Patricia. I think it's time we talked. Mother to daughter." The audacity of those last 4 words sent a wave of anger through Alara so intense that she had to stop walking and take several deep breaths. Mother to daughter. As if 29 years of absence could be erased with a text message now that millions of dollars were at stake. She didn't respond immediately, instead driving back to her grandfather's house, her house now, and sitting in his favorite chair in the garden. What would Harold advise in this moment? He would tell her to think strategically, not emotionally, to consider all angles before responding. After an hour of reflection, Alara composed a brief formal response. "All communication should go through my attorneys. Their contact information was included in our response to your notice." Patricia's reply came almost instantly. "We're family. We shouldn't need lawyers to talk to each other." The manipulation was so transparent that Alara almost laughed. She turned off her phone without responding and went inside to make dinner, her resolve strengthened by the attempted emotional manipulation. "I know this has been an intense family drama so far, and we're just getting to the turning point. Before we continue with how Alara handled this impossible situation, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who only showed up when there was something to gain? Drop a comment below about your experiences with family justice, and don't forget to hit that like button if you're finding this story of family vengeance, as compelling as it is heartbreaking. Subscribe to make sure you don't miss the conclusion, where we'll see if Alara's biological parents get what's coming to them. The legal battle began in earnest the following week. Michael's firm filed a comprehensive response to Patricia and Richard's challenge, systematically dismantling their claims with documented evidence of abandonment, the legally binding adoption, and Harold's unquestionable mental competence until his death. They also included affidavits from Harold's doctors, colleagues, and neighbors attesting to his sharp mental faculties even during his illness. What Alara hadn't anticipated was the media attention. A local Chicago newspaper picked up the story "Abandoned Daughter Battles Parents for Millionaire Grandfather's Estate," and from there, it spread to several online news outlets. The narrative was compelling. The hard-working student who had cared for her dying grandfather now facing a money grab from the parents who had abandoned her. Patricia and Richard responded with their own media campaign, giving an exclusive interview to a Sacramento newspaper, portraying themselves as victims who had been prevented from maintaining a relationship with their daughter by a controlling father-in-law. They claimed Harold had deliberately alienated Alara from them and had manipulated his will to punish Patricia for perceived slights decades earlier. "We only want what's fair," Patricia was quoted as saying. "A chance to rebuild our relationship with our daughter and to receive the inheritance my father would have wanted me to have if he hadn't been influenced by bitterness in his final days." The article included a family photo of Patricia with her husband and stepchildren, portraying her as a devoted mother who had never stopped thinking about the daughter she was forced to leave behind. Richard was described as a dedicated music teacher who had channeled his grief over losing his daughter into mentoring young musicians. The narrative was so completely at odds with Alara's lived experience that reading it made her physically ill. These strangers were not only trying to take her inheritance, but were actively rewriting the history of her childhood to paint themselves as victims rather than perpetrators. Dr. Torres, the therapist Michael had recommended, helped Alara process her rage and betrayal during twice-weekly sessions. "What they're doing is a form of gaslighting," she explained during one particularly difficult session. "They're trying to create an alternative reality that serves their interests regardless of the harm it causes you." "How do I fight that?" Alara asked, exhausted from the constant emotional bombardment. "With truth," Dr. Torres replied simply. "Your lived experience is real. Their narrative can't change that, no matter how loudly they proclaim it." 3 weeks into the legal proceedings, Patricia escalated her attempts at direct contact. She sent a handwritten letter to Alara's home address, filled with emotionally manipulative language about lost time and second chances. "I've dreamed of reconnecting with you for years," she wrote. "The loss of my father has reminded me how precious family is. Whatever financial matters are between us, couldn't we at least meet face to face?" Mother-to-daughter Alara brought the letter to her next therapy session, still unsure how to respond or whether to respond at all. "What do you want?" Dr. Torres asked after Alara had read the letter aloud. "Part of me wants to ignore it completely," Alara admitted. "But another part wants answers." Dr. Torres finished for her. "Yes. Why now? Why not when I graduated high school? Why not when I started college? Why only after there's money involved?" After careful consideration and consultation with both Dr. Torres and her legal team, Alara decided to agree to one meeting, but on her terms. The meeting would take place at Michael's office, with attorneys present, and would be formally documented. If Patricia and Richard truly wanted to reconnect, Alara reasoned they would agree to these conditions. To her surprise, they did. On a crisp September morning, Alara arrived at the law firm 30 minutes early, her stomach in knots. Dr. Torres had helped her prepare for this moment, but nothing could fully ready her for coming face to face with the people who had created her, then discarded her. Michael met her in the reception area. "You don't have to go through with this," he reminded her gently. "We can cancel at any time." Alara shook her head. "I need to do this. For me, not for them." At precisely 10:00 a.m., Patricia and Richard were shown into the conference room, where Alara waited with Michael and James. Seeing them in person was surreal. Patricia, now in her 50s, was slim and stylishly dressed, her blonde hair expertly highlighted. Richard looked older than his years, with deep lines around his eyes and a certain nervous energy as he entered the room. Their eyes fixed on Alara immediately, and Patricia gasped audibly. "You look so much like my mother," she said, her voice thick with emotion, or a convincing performance of emotion. Alara remained seated, her face carefully neutral. "Thank you for agreeing to these arrangements," she said formally. Patricia took a step forward, arms slightly raised as if for an embrace, but Michael smoothly intervened. "Please have a seat," he directed, gesturing to the chairs on the opposite side of the conference table. "As we discussed, this meeting will be recorded and our associate will be taking notes." The formality clearly wasn't what Patricia and Richard had hoped for, but they complied, settling into their chairs with visible discomfort. "Alara," Patricia began, leaning forward eagerly. "I can't tell you how many times I've imagined this moment. You've grown into such a beautiful young woman." "Why now?" Alara asked, directly, cutting through the pleasantries. "You've had 29 years to reach out. Why wait until grandfather died? Why wait until there was money involved?" Patricia flinched as if slapped. "It's not about the money," she protested. "I've thought about you every day since you left me at 4 months old and never came back." Alara interrupted, her voice steady, despite the emotions churning inside her. "Since you signed away your parental rights when I was 3, since you made no attempt to contact me on birthdays, holidays, graduations." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We were young," he offered weakly. "We made mistakes." "Abandoning your child isn't a mistake," Alara replied coldly. "It's a choice. A choice you made repeatedly year after year." Patricia's eyes welled with tears. "My father, your grandfather, he made it difficult. He judged us, controlled access to you." "That's a lie," Alara cut in, her composure finally cracking. "He documented every communication from you. There were exactly 7 contacts over 29 years, and every single one involved requests for money. Not once did either of you ask how I was doing, what my interests were, whether I was happy or healthy. Not once." Michael slid a folder across the table. "These are copies of all correspondence between Harold Peterson and Patricia or Richard Wilson from 1993 to 2023. You'll note that in Harold's responses, he repeatedly offered to facilitate contact with Alara if that was genuinely desired. Those offers were never accepted." Patricia stared at the folder without opening it. Richard at least had the decency to look ashamed. "We made mistakes," Patricia repeated, her voice hardening slightly. "But he was still my father. I have a right to a share of his estate." And there it was, the truth behind the tearful reunion attempt. "No," Alara said quietly but firmly. "You don't. You gave up that right when you abandoned your child. Grandfather raised me, loved me, supported me through everything. He was my father in every way that matters. The fact that you think you deserve anything after contributing nothing speaks volumes about your character." Richard leaned forward. "Look, Alara, we understand you're angry. You have every right to be. But surely there's room for compromise here. We're not asking for everything, just a fair share of what would have eventually come to Patricia anyway, as Harold's only child." "Except she's not his only child," Michael interjected smoothly. "Legally, Alara is also Harold's child through adoption, a process to which you both consented. And Harold was very explicit about his wishes." The meeting continued for another tense half-hour, with Patricia alternating between emotional appeals and thinly veiled legal threats. Richard mostly remained silent, occasionally nodding in support of Patricia's statements, but offering little of substance himself. When it became clear that Alara was not going to be swayed by either sentimentality or intimidation, Patricia's demeanor changed noticeably. The tearful would-be mother disappeared, replaced by something harder and more calculating. "You'll regret this," she said as she gathered her purse. "We're prepared to take this all the way to court. The publicity alone will make your life miserable." "Is that what Harold would have wanted for you?" Alara met her gaze steadily. "Grandfather prepared me for this exact scenario. He knew exactly who you were and what you might do. And yes, he would have wanted me to stand firm against emotional blackmail and frivolous legal challenges." As Patricia and Richard left the conference room, Alara remained seated, a strange calm settling over her. Seeing them in person had answered questions she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. There was no mysterious connection, no biological pull toward these strangers. They were exactly what Harold had described, people who had made choices based on their own interests, with little regard for the child they had created. "You did well," Michael told her after they had gone. "Very well." Alara nodded, feeling a curious sense of liberation. "They're not at all what I imagined as a child," she admitted. "I used to create these elaborate scenarios about why they left, what they might be like. The reality is so much smaller." Unfortunately, Michael said this meeting likely won't deter them from pursuing their legal challenge. If anything, your refusal to compromise might make them more determined. "I know," Alara replied, "but now I'm more determined too." In the days following the meeting, Patricia launched a more aggressive media campaign, giving tearful interviews about being denied a relationship with her daughter and disowned by her father. She portrayed herself as a victim of circumstances who had been forced to make an impossible choice as a young mother suffering from untreated postpartum depression. Richard, perhaps sensing the public's skepticism about parents who abandon their child, then reappear when money is involved, largely stayed out of the spotlight. When he did comment, it was to express regret for past mistakes and a desire for healing and reconciliation. Alara, on the advice of her legal team and doctor, Torres maintained a dignified silence in the press. Instead, she focused on her studies, returning to Northwestern for the fall semester, while the legal proceedings continued in the background. Her friends formed a protective circle around her, screening her calls, accompanying her to and from classes, when reporters lurked on campus, and providing normal college experiences amid the turmoil. As the case moved closer to court, Michael's team uncovered information that would prove crucial to their defense. Financial records showed that Patricia and Richard had experienced significant financial difficulties just prior to each of their attempts to contact Harold over the years. More damning still, they discovered evidence that Patricia had recently taken out a second mortgage on her home and had substantial credit card debt, suggesting a desperate need for money that aligned perfectly with the timing of the challenge to Harold's will. "They're going to argue that their financial situation is irrelevant," Diane warned during a strategy session. "That their motives don't matter if they have a legal claim." "Do they have a legal claim?" Alara asked, still worried, despite all the reassurances. "Technically, under normal circumstances, a child might have some claim on a parent's estate, even if not named in the will," James explained. "But these aren't normal circumstances. Your grandfather's adoption of you, the documented abandonment, and his explicit disinheritance of Patricia and Richard create a very strong case in our favor." As the court date approached, Patricia made one final attempt at manipulation. She sent Alara a small package containing a baby bracelet and a lock of fine blonde hair. "Your first bracelet from the hospital," the enclosed note read. "I've kept it all these years." "Doesn't that tell you something?" Alara stared at the tiny bracelet, a surge of emotion rising in her chest before a detail caught her eye. The name on the bracelet was smudged, but clearly didn't match her own. She showed it to Michael, who had it analyzed by an expert. The results confirmed her suspicion the bracelet belonged to some other infant, possibly purchased from a vintage shop or online marketplace. The deliberate deception hardened Alara's resolve to see this through to the end, no matter how difficult the court proceedings might be. The trial began on a cold November morning. Alara, dressed in a conservative charcoal suit, sat beside Michael at the plaintiff's table, trying to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. Across the courtroom, Patricia and Richard sat with their attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Andrea Lockwood, known for aggressive tactics in inheritance disputes. Judge Eleanor Ramirez, a veteran of the probate court with 23 years on the bench, entered the courtroom and the proceedings began with opening statements. Andrea Lockwood painted a sympathetic picture of Patricia, a young mother overwhelmed by postpartum depression, intimidated by her controlling father who had never stopped loving her child, but had been prevented from maintaining a relationship. This is not a case about abandonment, Lockwood argued, her voice ringing through the courtroom. This is about a father who used his financial and emotional power to separate a mother from her child, and who continued that punishment from beyond the grave by disinheriting his only daughter. When it was Michael's turn, he took a different approach, focusing not on emotional appeals but on the documented facts and legal precedents. This case is quite straightforward, Your Honor, he began. Harold Peterson legally adopted his granddaughter after her parents voluntarily terminated their parental rights. He raised her from infancy, provided for her education, and made a clear and legally sound decision about the disposition of his estate. The plaintiff's challenge is based not on legal merit but on opportunistic greed, as we will demonstrate through documented evidence of their decades-long absence and sudden interest that coincides precisely with financial need. The trial was expected to last 3 days, with testimony from various witnesses, including medical experts speaking to Harold's mental capacity, financial analysts outlining Patricia and Richard's monetary motivations and character, witnesses attesting to the relationship between Alara and her grandfather. On the first day, Patricia took the stand, delivering a tearful testimony about her struggles as a young mother and her father's alleged controlling behavior. She claimed Harold had threatened to cut her off financially if she didn't leave Alara with him, presenting their abandonment as a temporary arrangement that Harold had later refused to reverse. He told me it would be better for everyone if Richard and I had a fresh start, Patricia testified, dabbing at her eyes. He said he would take care of Alara until we got on our feet, but when we tried to come back for her, he made it impossible. He moved, changed his phone number, threatened legal action. During cross-examination, Michael methodically dismantled this narrative. He presented property records showing Harold had lived in the same house for 40 years, phone records showing his number had remained unchanged, and most damaging of all, the documented evidence of the formal adoption proceedings. Miss Lawson, these are the termination of parental rights forms, Michael said, displaying the documents on a screen for the court to see. This is your signature, correct? Patricia shifted uncomfortably. Yes, but I was pressured. And this is the statement you provided to the family court at that time. Michael continued, highlighting a section of text. It reads, I, Patricia Wilson, being of sound mind and under no duress, voluntarily relinquish my parental rights to Alara Wilson, understanding that this action is permanent and irrevocable. Did you make this statement under oath? Technically, yes, but Miss Lawson, were you represented by counsel during these proceedings? Patricia hesitated. Yes. And did your attorney explain the permanent nature of terminating parental rights? I suppose so, but just yes or no, please. Yes, Patricia admitted reluctantly. By the end of her testimony, Patricia's credibility had been severely damaged. Richard fared no better when he took the stand, contradicting several key points of Patricia's testimony and appearing evasive when questioned about the timing of their renewed interest in Alara, coinciding with Harold's decline. The most powerful testimony came on the second day when Dr. Melissa Chen, Harold's oncologist, took the stand to address the allegation that he had lacked testamentary capacity. Mr. Peterson was one of the most mentally sharp patients I've ever treated, Dr. Chen stated firmly. Even in his final weeks, when the physical effects of his illness were most pronounced, his cognitive functions remained remarkably intact. He was making informed decisions about his care, discussing complex treatment options, and managing his personal affairs with complete lucidity. On the third day, the financial expert testified, presenting a detailed timeline that overlaid Patricia and Richard's documented financial difficulties with their attempts to contact Harold. The pattern was undeniable. Each reach-out coincided with a financial crisis with no contact during periods of relative stability. Throughout the proceedings, Alara maintained her composure, even when Patricia's attorney tried to portray her as an entitled young woman seeking to deny her mother her rightful inheritance. During her own testimony, Alara spoke honestly about her childhood, her relationship with her grandfather, and the absence of Patricia and Richard in her life. "I don't hate them," she said quietly when asked about her feelings toward her biological parents. "I don't really know them. They're strangers to me. What I do know is that my grandfather was the only parent I ever had, and I want to honor his wishes." As the trial neared its conclusion, Judge Ramirez asked both sides for final arguments. Andrea Lockwood made an impassioned plea about family bonds and a daughter's rightful place in her father's estate, regardless of past conflicts. Michael's closing argument was measured and direct. "Your Honor, this case ultimately comes down to respecting the clear wishes of Harold Peterson, a man who stepped up to raise his granddaughter when her parents chose to walk away. He made provisions for her future with full mental capacity and clear intent. To invalidate his will would not only disregard his expressed wishes, but would reward decades of neglect and opportunistic behavior with a financial windfall. The law is clear, the evidence is overwhelming, and justice demands that Harold Peterson's will be upheld in its entirety." Judge Ramirez announced she would take the matter under advisement and issue her ruling within a week. For Alara, that week was excruciating. Despite the strong case they had presented, the uncertainty weighed on her heavily. What if the judge was swayed by Patricia's emotional appeals? What if some legal technicality worked in their favor? Dr. Torres helped her manage her anxiety during this waiting period, reminding her that regardless of the outcome, she had stood up for herself and for her grandfather's memory with dignity and courage. "Whatever happens with the money," Dr. Torres told her, "you've already claimed something much more valuable, your own narrative. You haven't let them rewrite your history or manipulate your emotions." The ruling came on a Friday afternoon. Michael called Alara while she was in the library studying for midterms. "The judge has issued her decision," he said, his tone giving nothing away. "Can you come to the office?" An hour later, Alara sat across from Michael's desk as he handed her the judicial ruling. "I think you'll want to read this yourself," he said, a smile finally breaking through his professional demeanor. Judge Ramirez's ruling was comprehensive and unequivocal. She dismissed Patricia and Richard's challenge on all counts, citing the overwhelming evidence of voluntary abandonment, the legally binding adoption, and Harold's clearly documented mental competence. More surprisingly, she ordered Patricia and Richard to pay Alara's legal fees, finding their challenge to be frivolous without merit and motivated by improper financial self-interest rather than genuine familial concern. In her closing paragraph, Judge Ramirez wrote, "The court finds it particularly troubling that the plaintiffs would attempt to capitalize on a relationship they voluntarily relinquished and made no effort to maintain for nearly 3 decades. To reward such behavior would not only contravene the clear wishes of the deceased, but would establish a precedent that parental obligations can be disregarded until financially convenient to acknowledge them. This court will not sanction such a cynical approach to family relationships." Alara read the ruling twice, letting the full impact sink in. It wasn't just a victory. It was a complete vindication. The judge had seen through Patricia and Richard's manipulations and had affirmed exactly what Harold had always taught her, that family is defined by actions, not blood, and that choices have consequences. "It's over," she asked Michael, still hardly daring to believe it. "It's over," he confirmed. "They can appeal, but given the strength of this ruling, their chances of success would be minimal." and the award of legal fees makes an appeal even more unlikely. They've already spent a considerable amount on this challenge. Alara felt a weight lift from her shoulders, one she hadn't fully acknowledged until it was gone. She wouldn't have to fight anymore. She could focus on her studies, on building her future, on honoring her grandfather's legacy in the ways that mattered most, through hard work, integrity, and compassion. As she left Michael's office, the late afternoon sun broke through the November clouds, casting long shadows across the city. Alara walked slowly, savoring the moment of closure. She thought about the journal Harold had left her, filled with his wisdom and memories. Tonight she would read from it again, not with grief but with gratitude for all he had given her. Her phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. "Any news?" Alara smiled and typed back, "We won. Completely. I'll tell you everything over dinner." As she walked home through the familiar neighborhood, past the park where Harold had taught her to ride a bike, past the ice cream shop where they had celebrated every report card, Alara felt her grandfather's presence more strongly than she had since his death. She could almost hear his voice. "Stars burn brightest in the darkest skies, my little Alara." The legal battle had indeed been a dark time, but she had emerged from it stronger and more certain of her path forward. The inheritance Harold had left her wasn't just financial. It was a legacy of love, resilience, and integrity that would guide her for the rest of her life. And as for Patricia and Richard, Alara decided she would waste no more energy on anger or resentment. They had shown who they were, and the court had seen it clearly. Justice had been served. That was enough. 1 year later, Alara stood in the bright June sunshine on Northwestern's campus, her graduation gown fluttering in the lake breeze. With a biomedical engineering degree in hand and an acceptance to Stanford's graduate program secured, she was exactly where Harold had always believed she would be: successful, purposeful, and moving forward with confidence. The months following the court case had brought both challenges and growth. Patricia had made one final attempt at contact, sending a letter that oscillated between angry accusations and tearful pleas for reconciliation. After careful consideration and discussion with Dr. Torres, Alara had decided not to respond. Some doors were better left closed. Instead, she had channeled her energy into creating something meaningful from her inheritance. Working with Michael, she had established the Harold Peterson Educational Foundation, a nonprofit that provided scholarships to students raised by grandparents or other non-parent relatives. It was a way to honor her grandfather's legacy while helping others facing similar family situations. As the graduation ceremony concluded and students dispersed to find their families amid the crowd, Alara felt a momentary pang of sadness that Harold wasn't there to see her achievement. But then she remembered something he had often told her: "I'm proudest not of what you accomplish, but of who you are while accomplishing it." She had faced one of the most difficult challenges imaginable, a betrayal from those who should have protected her most, and had emerged not bitter or broken, but stronger and more compassionate. That she knew would have made her grandfather prouder than any degree. Looking out at her future, Alara felt ready for whatever came next, carrying with her the most valuable inheritance of all: the love and wisdom of the man who had chosen to be her father when biology had failed her. What an incredible journey we've been on together through this family vengeance story. I'd love to know, have you ever had to stand up for yourself against family who only showed up when there was something to gain? Share your experiences in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button if this story resonated with you, and subscribe for more real-life dramas with satisfying karma endings. Thank you so much for watching this story about how family betrayal led to an unexpected justice served moment. Until next time, remember that family isn't always who you're born to. It's who loves you enough to stay.